Cara Barton, a woman from the past. Gabriela invited me to talk about myself, and I didn't know what to do because I told her that the only way to do this was to talk about myself, but in third person, that it would make it easier for me. So I was one woman from the past that came from a minority group, which was the women's group in those times that I lived in the United States of America. And this is the story of Cara Barton. Cara Barton was the youngest of 5 children in a Massachusetts farming family. She was 10 years younger than the last sibling. As a child, Cara Barton heard stories of wartime from her father, and then she took care of her brother David through a long illness. At 15, Cara Barton began teaching in a school that her parents started to help her learn to transcend her shyness and hesitation to ask. After a few years of teaching in local schools, Cara Barton started school in North Oxford and served as a superintendent. Then she went to study at the Liberal Institute in New York and began teaching in a school in Bordentown, New Jersey. At that school, she convinced the community to make the school free, an unusual practice in New Jersey at that time. But the school grew from 6 students to 600 students. But of course, because of this, they determined that the school should be headed by a man and not a woman. And with this appointment, Clara was very disappointed, of course, but as I said, she was one of many women as a minority group. And so she resigned. She resigned after a total of 18 years of teaching. But in her hometown, the congressman in 1854 helped her obtain an appointment by Clark Mason, Commissioner of Patents, to work as a copyist in the patent office in Washington, D.C. She was the first woman in the United States to hold such a government appointment. She copied secret papers during her time in this job. That was 1857 to 1860 approximately, with an administration that supported slavery, which she opposed. That's why she left Washington, but continued working at her copyist job by mail. She returned to Washington only after the election of President Lincoln, of course. During the Civil War, the soldiers had lost many of their belongings along the way, and Cara Barton began her Civil War service by responding to this situation, and she decided to work to provide supplies for the troops. Advertising widely and successfully after the battle at Bull Run, she talked to the Surgeon General into letting her personally distribute supplies to wounded and sick soldiers. And she personally cared for some who needed nursing service when she was there. By the next year, she had gained the support of generals such as John Pope and James Wadsworth, and she had traveled with supplies to several battlefields and sometimes nursing the wounded. She was granted permission to become then the superintendent of nurses. Through the Civil War, Cara Barton worked without any official supervision and without being part of any organization, including the Army or the Sanitary Commission, although she worked close with both. She worked mostly in Virginia and Maryland and occasionally in battles of other states. Her contribution was primarily not as a nurse, but only if she needed when she was around at a hospital or a battlefield, because she was primarily as an organizer of supply, delivery, arriving at battlefields and hospitals with wagons full of sanitary supplies. She also worked to identify the dead and wounded so that the families could know what happened to their loved ones. Though a supporter of the Union in serving wounded soldiers, she served both sides. She didn't have a side. She was neutral, and that's why she became called an angel of the battlefield. When the Civil War ended, Cara Barton went to Georgia to identify the Union soldiers in an unmarked graves who had died in the Confederate prison camp in Andersonville. She helped establish a national cemetery there. She returned to work out of a Washington, D.C. office to identify more of the missing, of course, as a head of a missing persons office, established with the support of President Lincoln. She was the first woman burial head in the United States government. Her 1869 report documented the fate of about 20,000 missing soldiers, almost one-tenth the total number of missing or unidentified. Cara Barton lectured widely about her war experience, and without getting enmeshed in any organization of women's rights, she also made a campaign for winning the vote for women. About the American Red Cross, in 1869, Cara Barton traveled to Europe for her health, where she heard for the first time about the Geneva Convention, which had been established in 1866, but which the United States had not signed. This treaty established the International Red Cross, which was also something Barton first heard when she came to Europe. The leaderships of the Red Cross began to talk to her in order to get her support in the U.S., but Barton became involved with the International Red Cross to deliver sanitary supplies instead. To various venues, including to free parties, honor her work by heads of state in Germany and Baden. Ill with rheumatic fever, she returned to the United States in 1873. The Reverend Henry Bellows of the Sanitary Commission had established an American organization associated with International Red Cross, but in 1866 it only lasted to 1871. When she recovered, she began working for the ratification of the Geneva Convention, finally, to establish the Red Cross affiliate. She persuaded President Garfield and the President Arthur for the ratification of the treaty in the Senate, finally winning the approval in 1882. At that point, the American Cross was formally established, and Cara Barton became the first president of this organization, and she worked for 23 years, with a brief break in 1883 to act as a women's prison superintendent in Massachusetts. In what has been called the American Amendment, because Red Cross not only worked in wars, but also in epidemic and natural disasters, expanded the mission. So that's why Cara Barton traveled so much to administer aid, including in Johnston flood, Galveston wave, Tiles well, Cincinnati flood, Florida yellow fever epidemic, Spanish American War, and Armenian massacre in Turkey. Though Cara Barton was remarkably successful in using personal efforts to organize Red Cross campaigns, she was not successful in administrating. It was very difficult. So, when some in the organization fought against her methods, she fought back, but complaints about financial record keeping and other conditions reached Congress, which reincorporated the American Red Cross in 1900 and insisted in improved financial procedures. Cara Barton resigned finally to the American Cross in 1904. And though she considered founding another organization, she finally retired to Glen Echo, Maryland, where she died on a Good Friday, just exactly like President Lincoln on a Good Friday, and exactly the same month in April, but of course several years later, many years later. She died on Good Friday, April 12, 1912, without getting married and with no children.